In this lecture, we cover the miasma theory of disease, variolation and vaccination, microscopy and bacteria, or the discovery of microorganisms invisible to the naked eye, and the development of the germ theory of disease in the 1800s. In the miasma theory of disease, smell is somehow responsible for contagion. Decaying matter escaping into the air pollutes the air. And in the Ronald Rees reading, he notes that the sources of miasma, or foul air, were warm air, moisture from stagnant waters, marshes, river bottoms, or even forests. So in this image we have before us, there's this ghostly cholera cloud from the epidemic of 1831. It's kind of this ghoulish embodiment of the disease of cholera. And it's underlined by the comment that in war, cholera tramples the victors and the vanquished both. So malaria is bad air, malaria, of a filth associated with smell. And we have already seen this fear and explanations of disease from malaria, or bad air, with the Black Death, when people feared that the smell of death and dying might be a source of contagion. So this was the idea that we saw in the beak of the 17th century plague doctor, with his herbs and spices tucked inside that beak. The woodcut on the left is from the late 1400s, and here a physician uses a pomander while he treats a man sick with plague. So to prevent infection, the doctor, or person who wanted to stay healthy, needed to cover the odor with a pleasant smell. And on the right we see a German spice box made of silver, sometimes they're made of gold, and this one is from the 16th century. So these were almost like jewels, or sometimes had jewels encrusted in them, and these pomanders made from gold or silver were luxury items to prevent people from becoming ill. And each piece had a sliding cover, and you could open it a bit like an orange segment, and you could put in sweet-smelling spices and herbs, just like the plague doctor did. And the idea was that these sweet smells would counteract the rotten smells from people who didn't wash very often, but also from the bad vapors or the bad air or miasma, which was given off by decaying matter and was believed to cause disease. So this is an example in a portrait. You can find them also in portraits of, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I of England. This particular portrait is of a city councillor in the Netherlands from 1518. So the miasma theory of disease was actively believed from the 1300s, in the time of the Black Death, and into the 1800s. It was like 500 years there at least of miasma theory of disease. And in Edwin Chadwick's report on the sanitary conditions of the laboring population of Great Britain of 1842, he continues to describe the stench in some of the slums of the poor that he visits in preparing this report. As he says, "I was assailed by a most disagreeable smell, and it was clear to me that the air was full of the most injurious malaria." But the idea was beginning to be questioned, if only by the political cartoonists and satirists, as we see here in the middle of an epidemic, which killed about 32,000 people in Britain in 1832. So here we see the London Board of Health hunting after cases like cholera. And if we look here, there's a broadsheet lying on the ground that announces looseness of the bowels is the beginning of cholera. And here are the various members of the boards of health trying to find the source of cholera by hunting for smells. "The scent lies strong here. Do you see anything?" "Positively we must find something. It won't do to lose our 20 guineas a day. Oh, if I can but find a smell." And here you see another board member looking and smelling at a grate to see what he can find. And again, the idea remained that burning and smoke could cleanse and purify the air to prevent contagion, as we see here in this illustration of fumigating the streets against the cholera epidemic in Exeter in 1832. So this is part of the same epidemic across Britain and across Europe, actually across France and Germany, Italy was a very wide-ranging epidemic across Europe. So some ideas were developing about alternative ways to prevent disease, a procedure called variolation, which would later be refined and improved to become what we know today as vaccination. This is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, a nice, quite aristocratic name. She was a survivor of smallpox, which we've already discussed in the Columbian Exchange Disease and Population lecture. And her son is depicted here with her, and she had him inoculated against smallpox in 1718. So Lady Mary was the wife of the British ambassador in Istanbul, then called Constantinople, and it was part of the Ottoman Empire then, and she learned of a way of preventing or minimizing the disease. And her letter back to a friend in the UK is one of your primary source readings for this unit, and you can read about the technique she discovered there. She later convinced the Princess of Wales to inoculate the royal children, so it became more fashionable in high society to do so. This practice also spread in the early 1720s to the US, when there was a smallpox outbreak in Boston. Variolation was used to try to minimize the epidemic, and this was a technique that Americans learned from their African slaves who had brought the practice with them to the Americas. Edward Jenner had been inoculated against smallpox as a boy in the 1720s using variolation. As a country doctor, he began vaccination experiments because he and other rural folk had observed that milkmaids never became ill with smallpox. So his experiment was to discover why dairy workers had this natural immunity. The illustration on the left shows an arm inoculated with smallpox, as Lady Mary Wortley Montagu recommended, while the illustration on the right shows an arm inoculated with cowpox, which was Jenner's experiment, that cows had a variation of smallpox. In 1796, during an epidemic that killed about 35,000 people in the UK, Jenner took the fluid from the hands of the dairymaid Sarah Nelms, who was affected with cowpox, and inoculated a young boy who got a mild case of cowpox. He later exposed the boy to smallpox, and the boy did not become ill. Jenner then tried the same thing on villagers and on his servants. You can kind of question his ethical practices there. It's a little bit different in the 1700s. None became ill with smallpox. So by 1840, variolation, as it had been practiced in the 1700s, became illegal, while in 1853, vaccination became compulsory, and this legislation was again introduced in 1867 and 1871 because of people's resistance and fear of vaccination, which of course continues today, not always on medical or scientific grounds. And because of a European smallpox epidemic in 1870 to 75, the German Vaccination Act was also introduced in 1871. And smallpox, because of vaccination, has been entirely eradicated. The very last live case of smallpox was in 1977, and the World Health Organization declared it eradicated in 1980. Another shift from miasma theory came with the scientific experiments that magnified what one could see with the naked eye. With a microscope, amateurs as well as scientists began to discover microorganisms and bacteria. One of these pioneers was the Dutchman Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He wrote to the Royal Society about his observations on the plaque between his own teeth. I might have a hard time reading this without laughing. A little white matter, which is as thick as if 'twere batter. He repeated these observations on two ladies, probably his own wife and daughter, and on two old men who had never cleaned their teeth in their lives. Looking at these samples with his microscope, Leeuwenhoek repeated how, in his own mouth, I then most always saw, with great wonder, that in the said matter there were very many little living animalcules, very prettily a-moving, the biggest sort, had a very strong and swift motion and shot through the water, or spittle, like a pike does through the water. The second sort oft-times spun round like a top, and these were far more in number. In the mouth of one of the old men, Leeuwenhoek found an unbelievably great number of little animalcules, a-swimming more nimbly than I had ever seen up to this time. The biggest sort bent their body into curves going forwards. Moreover, The other animalcules were in such enormous numbers that all the water seemed to be alive. So there was a growing awareness of bacteria, but not yet a realization that the microscopic animalcules, as they were called for a while, might be responsible for infection or disease. But in the 1800s, with industrialization and overcrowding in the cities, there were increasing problems with drinking water, as crowded slums had cesspools of human waste near water pumps, and sewage and chemical waste went into the rivers. So Punch magazine published a series of satirical cartoons about the state of the River Thames, cutting through London. We might see here this cartoonist's impression of a drop of water from the River Thames under a microscope. It reveals what creatures might live there, and in turn what Londoners could be swallowing on a daily basis. Monster soup, commonly called Thames water, being a correct representation of that precious stuff doled out to us. The alternative title below reads, Microcosm, dedicated to the London water companies, brought forth all monstrous prodigious things, hydras and gorgons. So here we see an elegantly dressed woman. She's looking at a magnified drop of water, and she drops her teacup in her horror at what she sees. In the mid-1800s, doctors and chemists began to make the connection between the invisible creatures and disease. The doctor John Snow had lived through the cholera epidemic of 1831 to 1832 and had published on cholera. In August and September 1854, 200 people in a tiny part of Soho in London around Broad Street were struck with cholera, but only the households in a few streets were affected, eventually killing 600 people in the neighborhood. John Snow constructed a map of the households affected, street by street, to track the spread of the disease, and he realized that all the deaths clustered in and around Broad Street were where there was a water pump, and there had been no cases in areas where a family might go to another pump. So they actually removed the handle from the Broad Street pump. John Snow's hypothesis, published with this map in 1855, was that a microbe might cause cholera, but he died before his theories were proven by the work of Louis Pasteur in France in the mid-1800s and Robert Koch in Germany in the later 1800s. So a few years after John Snow's discoveries, which still really weren't quite yet accepted, we have, again published in Punch, Father Thames introducing his offspring to the fair city of London. So the cartoon depicts the personification of London, who's the woman on the left with a crown and a shield. And she meets Father Thames, who's kind of the scruffy guy with long hair, and the three diseases, diphtheria, scrofula, or tuberculosis, and cholera. And we can see that the Thames is full of debris and sewage. If we return to the germ theory of disease, as you probably know, food and wine is and was big business in France, and this is true in the 19th century. So Louis and Marie Pasteur studied fermentation of wine and beer and its spoilage, because spoilage ate into the profits of these industries. They discovered that the spoilage of wine and beer was caused by living microorganisms or bacteria that Pasteur could see through the microscopes in the laboratory. Now, he was not a doctor, but a chemist, and we pasteurize milk today, or use pasteurized milk to make cheese, because heat and boiling kills the bacteria. Pasteur also discovered, accidentally when he left some chicken cholera in his lab over a hot summer vacation, that by heating certain pathogens, he could attenuate it or limit its intensity and use it for vaccination to stimulate the immune system of the body to attack the organism. He developed vaccines for chicken cholera, anthrax, and rabies. Similarly, Robert Koch, working in Berlin, isolated the bacterium causing tuberculosis, and in 1883 identified the cholera bacillus. He developed staining techniques to help see organisms under a microscope, and established a series of criteria for identifying a microorganism. He eventually won the 1905 Nobel Prize in Medicine. Remember from the Black Death lecture that in the 1890s, the Swiss German Alexandre Yersin identified Yersinia pestis as the bacterium that caused the bubonic plague. It was the same outbreak that, because of steamships and long-distance shipping, made its way to Australia, New Zealand, and San Francisco. And here we see attempts to kill the rats and fleas and prevent the spread by dipping rats in gasoline. Because in Liverpool, one of the biggest port cities for emigration from the UK, there were a series of cases near the docks and near the port of human plague.